Hello everyone, I'm Wendell Jones and welcome to this edition of the program, The Platform. On this program we examine the national issues of the Bahamas, and we are in the hurricane season, and many Bahamians are wondering if we are going to have a major hurricane this year, 2015. We don't know, but we know that we ought to be prepared for the eventuality whenever a hurricane comes. And if you live in the Caribbean or Florida, you've probably heard about the great Okeechobee hurricane, which killed thousands and left wide swaths of destruction. It is said that this massive storm killed at least 2,500 people in the United States, of which approximately 1,400 were Bahamian migrants, becoming the second deadliest hurricane in the history of the United States of America, behind only the great Galveston hurricane of 1900. And Hurricane Okeechobee was in 1920. And to this date, it remains the deadliest hurricane ever to strike the Bahamas. And these hurricanes have been recorded in books by Wayne Neely, who attended the Caribbean Meteorological Institute in Barbados, where he majored in and specialized in weather forecasting. And he is an international speaker, best-selling author, educator, and meteorologist in the Department of Meteorology here in the Bahamas. And he has worked in the Met Office for more than 24 years. And it is our pleasure to have Wayne Neely back with us as our guest today. Welcome again.
It's a pleasure to be back, Mr. Jones.
Thank you so very much. Yes. You must be selling a whole lot of books these days.
Yes, they do. My books seem to take a liking to the Bahamians. Also, it sells internationally as well. And this one, the book, is the #1 selling book for the book company this year.
Is that right?
Yes.
Good. And how many books have you produced on hurricanes?
I've written 9 books, and my newest book should be out shortly. It's on the greatest and deadliest hurricanes of the North Atlantic.
Of the North Atlantic?
Yes.
And so these books have great international appeal,
yes,
I believe.
Yes, and a lot of them, and most of the universities in the United States purchase them. And my books in the university in Japan, all the universities in Japan, in China, in Australia, New Zealand, and several other, in Pakistan as well, several other countries, yeah, throughout the United States, Canada, and the rest of the world.
So you found a niche, so to speak.
Yes. I never thought, actually, when I started writing the first book I wrote, I did that to kill time. I never thought I'd write another book after that, but the response was so great that I just continued, and they provided an avenue for me to define my talents.
Yeah. How do you go about researching these hurricanes? I mean, the last time you were here, I can't remember which one we were talking about.
We were talking about the 1929 hurricane.
The 1929
yes.
hurricane, and many of our viewers and listeners found that program very interesting indeed,
yes.
because there were a lot of people who watched the program who were born around that same time.
Right, yes.
And so Bahamians, a lot of them who are alive today, remember the
storm very well.
The storm, yes, especially in the southeastern
yes.
islands, eh?
Yes.
And then it impacted New Providence in a great
part Andros as well,
yes,
significantly.
Yes. That was the time, I think it was Blind
Lake, Run Come See Jerusalem.
Run Come See Jerusalem, yes. Well, tell us about the great Okeechobee hurricane of 1928.
It was actually the 8th deadliest hurricane in the North Atlantic history. It is the deadliest hurricane in Bahamian history, and it's the 2nd deadliest hurricane in American history. It was a storm, it occurred in 1928. It was a time, an era that they didn't have, first of all, they didn't have adequate storm warnings, and also in that time they didn't name the hurricanes back then. They never started naming the hurricanes until 1950. And so they named them after several things. If you read the book, you'll find exactly how how they named the storms. One of the things that they did, they named them after the area that they impacted. And this storm came through the Bahamas, devastated the Bahamas, and it went on to South Florida in the Okeechobee region. And what happened, it went over the lake, and the lake water, the surge from the lake flooded the surrounding towns and settlements. Most of those settlements were occupied by Bahamian workers. Most of the migrant workers back then in South Florida, not like they are now, where they have Mexicans and everything, but back then, most of the migrant workers were actually Bahamian workers. And approximately 2,500 persons died in that storm. And 75% of that total, according to the records in the United States and at the National Hurricane Center and the Red Cross, 2,500 were died in that storm in Florida. And of that total, 75% of that were black Bahamian workers. Sorry, black migrant workers, and 75% of that total was black Bahamian workers.
Okay.
And many of them, not even to this day, they have two mass graves in South Florida. I went to Florida for several times to do research on this book, and it's a book that really touched me, like any other book that I went to the graves of where they buried them in mass. The whites had graves. They buried the whites in the white cemetery. They were documented. The names are written down. You can find exactly who died in that storm when it comes to the white persons. But the black, because most of them were black migrant workers, and it was an era where they had the Jim Crow system in the United States. So a lot of those black workers were simply just buried in mass graves, in two mass grave sites. And most of those persons who buried there were Bahamian workers. And it's one time that I heard the Prime Minister ask him if he can, if only recognized that those two areas with either a plaque or some kind of recognition for and on behalf of the Bahamian people, because a lot of those persons, they not even remember. The only times they remember is their parents or grandparents told you about the storm. So it was a great storm.
Do you have any names of like surnames even,
well,
of people who were caught in that storm and who died?
Well, before I wrote the book, I had some names, but after I wrote the book, I got a lot of persons calling me, and several up to last week, I think I got two persons called me. They bought the book and they said their families were in that storm. Some of them called their names and say who they were. But back then, it was an area they didn't have the census in the United States. The blacks were not included in the census. And second, a lot of the migrant workers, they said, were only known by nicknames. So even though they didn't really worry about documenting them, they were simply worried about burying them and getting the region back to normalcy.
And there's no record, say, even in our archives here,
no,
or the library of people who would have been working on farms in the U.S. in 1928.
No, and that didn't occur. In fact, nowadays you can tell now on the contract, during the contract, which occurred a bit later, they have the names of both persons who went on.
Right.
Because they had documentation, but they didn't document themselves back then. Back then, I can put it this way, it was like the Haitians of today.
Right.
A lot of Haitians come to the Bahamas, and if one of them died, chances are most persons wouldn't know about that. And the Bahamian, the effect on South Florida was the same thing for the Bahamians in 1928.
It is interesting that you said that, because many people look at the Haitians who come in from northern Haiti,
yes,
and do not realize that Bahamians were once in that kind of predicament.
Yes.
And had to go to the United States in search of
employment. Yes.
Employment. So they were economic refugees.
Yes.
I'd say the Haitians are economic
Right.
refugees coming
Yes.
in from Haiti.
Yes, that's correct, because nowadays we look down on the Haitians and say, but why are they leaving their country? But back then the Bahamians had the same, because back then you had the decline in sponging, and employment was really rough in those areas. So a lot of persons, especially on the family islands, they simply went to the United States to find work for employment. They send their money back, and with that money they sent it back to their families. And,
Yes.
And for example, in one case, Angliston, the area that we know as Angliston, that was actually built because of this hurricane.
The migrants
send money back
back.
to build like Angliston, and to a lesser extent Baintown and several of the low income housing areas.
in 1928.
Yes, 1920. Yeah, the money that they made from farming, they send the money back to the farm, and those areas developed because of that money that they sent back to their families.
In terms of the devastation of the great Okeechobee hurricane, that was similar to Katrina, wouldn't you say?
Yes, it was, and to a great extent, even more dangerous than Katrina, because back then it killed, like I said, 2,500 Bahamian workers. I mean, 2,500 workers in Miami. It devastated the region as well. It not only devastated the Bahamas, it devastated the entire region. Approximately 5,000, I think it's 4,118 persons died in the region itself. And in the Bahamas, it was unusually low death toll in the Bahamas. They only had 3 persons died in the Bahamas on record, in Bahamas itself, and you had 18 persons in Turks and Caicos Islands. And so back then, it was not what do you call a major, but it devastated the Bahamas. You had places like Trinity Methodist Church, all of the a lot of the mail boats were destroyed. For example, one of them was a mail boat called None Such. None Such was destroyed in the 1926 hurricane, July 1926. They built it back. It was destroyed in the 1928 hurricane. They rebuilt None Such again in the 1929 hurricane. It was destroyed. 1932 hurricane, it was also destroyed, and 1933. I don't find any more records after that. So
hopefully they stop building.
They stop building, yes, or either name it or not name it, none other than None Such. And the same thing with Trinity Methodist Church. Trinity Church was destroyed in this hurricane. Trinity Church was destroyed in the 1926 hurricane and the 1929 hurricane. Yeah. And remember, back then they didn't have building codes, so the buildings were substandard, but the churches were built, I think, a bit stronger. But so even when you had a major hurricane impacting that area, it basically destroyed. A lot of the churches were destroyed. St. Agnes Church, St. John's on Meeting Street was destroyed in this storm, and many others. But most of the book, it devastated the Bahamas, but most of the book is concerned with the deaths of those Bahamian workers in South Florida.
I know St. Agnes was destroyed, St. Agnes Anglican Church in one.
Oh, St. Agnes was also destroyed in this hurricane.
In 1928
in 1928 and 29.
And 29.
Yes.
Okay. And St. John's was destroyed in the 28 hurricane.
Yes, the 28 hurricane, and it was damaged in the 1929 hurricane.
Okay.
And I think Zion had damage to its roof in the 28 hurricane as well.
Well, most of the churches in the city area were destroyed.
Yes.
Ebenezer as well, eh?
Yes. And because of these storms, this is the reason why we're the first country in the region that had building codes. It was because of the 1929 hurricane that they started the process of having building codes, because many of the places were destroyed. A lot of the buildings were destroyed, so they tried to have a building code so as to mitigate the damage caused by these storms.
Okay. When we return on the program, I'd like to talk about where the storm was formed.
Yes.
Because we know Katrina was formed off Long Island.
Just east of the Bahamas. Central Bahamas, yes.
In the central
Just
Bahamas.
Yes.
And so let's talk about the great Okeechobee hurricane. Only name Okeechobee because of the number of people who died in the United States.
Yes, it was named because what they did, they named them after the area that they devastated. For example, if a storm caused 3 deaths in Nassau and 1,000 in South Florida, they will name it after the city in Florida. For example, the 1926 hurricane of July was called the Nassau Hurricane of 1926 in the record, but because it devastated Nassau.
More than anywhere else.
Yes. Okay. And 1929 hurricane, we know it as the 1929 hurricane, but in the record books, they call it either the Great Andros Island Hurricane of 1929 or the Great Bahamas Hurricane of 1929.
Because more damage took place at Andros than anywhere else. Okay.
Okay.
All right. Let's take a break here on the program. The Great Okeechobee Hurricane of 1928. Wayne Neely, our guest on the program. We'll come right back.